When it comes to velocity banking, the strategy usually aims to serve two main purposes: pay off debt faster and save on interest. And to achieve this, it uses a line of credit, typically a HELOC, to provide additional capital. This HELOC can then be used to make additional lump sum payments onto existing debt, such as a mortgage. Once the lump sum payment is made from the HELOC, the individual will still, of course, need to pay back that HELOC. So over the coming months, they will still make their regular mortgage payments, but now they will also make payments to satisfy their HELOC. Failing to make payments on the HELOC comes with the risk of potentially losing one's home, as a person's home is used as collateral to secure a HELOC. So the question that then commonly comes up is, am I better off using my additional monthly cash flow to implement velocity banking and satisfy my HELOC loan, or am I better off putting my additional cash flow into other investment options? This video will aim to answer this question by comparing velocity banking to alternative options and comparing the overall savings and risk of each strategy. Please note that the goal of the video is not focused on what velocity banking actually is. If you do not already have a good understanding of what the strategy is, I first suggest watching our explainer video before coming back to this video. We will leave a link down below in the description. To better understand alternatives, let's look at an example. Let's imagine that Ron currently has a $500,000 30-year fixed-rate mortgage on his new home at 8%. Ron has also secured a HELOC of $20,000 at an interest rate of 15%. Ron is considering using the velocity banking strategy to pay off his mortgage faster, but first, Ron would like to evaluate alternatives to see if there are better options than velocity banking. Ron currently has a monthly income of $6,500 and $5,000 in monthly expenses. His mortgage payment of $3,668 is included in these expenses. This leaves Ron with an additional cash flow of $1,500 a month. If Ron did use velocity banking, this $1,500 would be used to satisfy his HELOC loan. But Ron wants to see what would happen if instead of using velocity banking, he invested the extra $1,500 in an index fund. Let's imagine that Ron finds an index fund that has historically provided investors with an annual return of 8%. So if Ron decides to invest his $1,500 of monthly cash flow into this fund for the entire 30-year period of his mortgage, at the end of the mortgage, he will have just above $2 million and his mortgage will be fully paid off. Over these 30 years, Ron will pay over $850,000 in interest alone on his mortgage. Now, let's compare this to if Ron instead used velocity banking. As previously mentioned, Ron currently has access to a $20,000 HELOC. Ron will then take this $20,000 and make a lump sum payment onto his mortgage. After paying back his HELOC in about 13 months, Ron will repeat the process of making an additional lump sum payment. If Ron is able to stay consistent with this strategy, he will be able to pay off his mortgage in approximately 13 years and 9 months. Over this 13-year period, Ron will pay a total of $323,000 in interest. So to summarize, by using velocity banking, Ron can pay his mortgage around 16 years faster and save around $527,000 on interest. Of course, Ron will still need to pay interest on his HELOC, which at his rate of 15% will be around $3,000 a year, and around $41,000 over the course of his 13 years of paying his mortgage. Please note that the annual interest charge on the HELOC of $3,000 is a very conservative estimate, and if Ron properly uses velocity banking, this number will be much lower. This then brings his total interest savings down to around $485,000. But what we also now need to factor into our comparison is that after this 13-year period, Ron will now be mortgage-free, which means he now has additional cash flow. Since Ron will no longer have his monthly mortgage payment of $3,668, he will now have $5,168 in monthly cash flow. This number is calculated by taking Ron's previous cash flow of $1,500 and now adding his monthly mortgage payment. For comparison's sake, let's now imagine that after paying off his mortgage, Ron decides to take his $5,168 in additional monthly cash flow and invest it in the same index fund that has traditionally earned 8%. If Ron continues to do this for the next 16 years, he will have approximately $1,950,000. So now, in this scenario, over the 30-year period, Ron will have paid off his mortgage in full after around 14 years and will have $1,950,000 in his index fund at the end of the 30 years. Now let's pause here and compare this to our other scenario, which is if Ron had just made his regular mortgage payments over the 30 years and invested the rest of his cash flow into an index fund over that same period. In this case, at the end of the 30 years, Ron would have over $2 million in his index fund and would have paid around $850,000 in interest. As we can see, this $2 million is only slightly more than our other scenario, but the big difference really comes in the interest paid. Without using velocity banking, Ron paid $850,000 in total interest on his mortgage compared to $364,000 when he used velocity banking. This is a difference of $486,000. So based on this example, it's pretty apparent that velocity banking can be extremely powerful even when being compared to alternatives such as investing additional cash flow in an index fund. However, it's extremely important to note that this is only an example and many variables could significantly change our results. For example, if Ron was able to earn a higher annual return with his index fund of, say, 11%, this would make our scenario of not using velocity banking much more attractive, as his funds would have more time to compound at a much higher interest rate. As well, our example is based on the assumption that Ron could consistently earn an 8% return. However, in reality, this number would fluctuate and his average annual return could look a lot different after 30 years. On the other hand, if for example Ron had had a much lower mortgage rate, this could also make the velocity banking option less appealing. That is why it is always important whenever making your own financial decisions to do your proper research, speak with professionals, and come up with strategies that are aligned with your own personal financial goals and situation. And lastly, when it comes to this example, one factor that isn't taken into consideration is the risk of each strategy. Of course, when it comes to the index funds, there is lots of rooms for fluctuations. We could see a much lower return than 8%, or the return could be much greater. And when it comes to velocity banking, to really be successful with the strategy, you need to have very strong discipline. If in our example, Ron wasn't able to display discipline, our results would look a lot different. Thank you for watching today's video, and if you found the content to be helpful, it would be greatly appreciated if you could leave a thumbs up and really consider subscribing to the channel for more content related to velocity banking and everyday finance.